evening. This is Peter Hammond in the studio for From the Front Line. And tonight we're wanting to focus on recognizing false flags and subversion campaigns. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 9, verse 5, we read, "Everyone will deceive his neighbor and will not speak the truth. They have taught their tongue to speak lies. They weary themselves to commit iniquity." And as we look at so much that's hit the news headlines in 2025, and as we are about to enter into 2026, we need to distinguish between false flags and real news. There's a lot of fake news, fake history, there's even fake religion, fake missions, fake churches out there. We need to recognize what is true. As our Lord Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. We are lost. Jesus is the way. We are deceived. Jesus is the truth. We are dead in our trespasses and sins. Jesus is the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. That is the word of God. Well, what is a false flag? The term false flag originally referred to pirate ships, which flew flags of countries as a disguise to persuade their victims that they were to be trusted and maybe to come alongside, and to dissuade the victims from fleeing or preparing for battle. So sometimes the flag of another country was used in order to blame an attack incorrectly on a targeted country. So today the term false flag extends way past naval encounters to include countries and organizations that organize attacks on themselves and make the attacks appear to be made by their opponents. So in this way, a false flag operation seeks to give a government the desired pretext for either domestic aggression or foreign military aggression. So covert government agencies frequently use civilian organizations, or non-governmental organizations so-called, to carry out operations which serve government interests. So the definition of a false flag is false flag operations are covert operations conducted by governments, corporations, or other organizations which are designed to appear as if they were carried out by their enemies or by other entities. The name is derived from the military concept of flying false colors, that is, flying the flag of a country other than your own. False flag operations are not limited to war and counterinsurgency operations and have been used in peacetime, for example, during Italy's strategy of tension. Now, if you think in a popular movie, you might have seen Master and Commander, excellent naval dramatic film set during Napoleonic War, and the British ship, the Surprise, flew a false flag so that they could entice the French raider to come close to them while they prepared to basically ambush and surprise the French vessel with a full military response. And so sometimes pretending that you are a vulnerable victim can encourage your enemy to come in close. People have even done this, especially in the police, sending out a policewoman, pretending to be some helpless woman on the street, hoping that somebody will be stupid enough to try and mug her, and then they get themselves arrested or shot. And so that's another way of doing a false flag operation. But we're thinking now of big news items. So although it is forbidden by the Geneva Convention and by the Hague Rules of Warfare, false flag operations are pervasive. The Geneva Convention prohibits, under Article 37, the feigning of an intent to negotiate under flag of truce or of surrender, feigning of an incapacitation by wounds or sickness, the feigning of civilian non-combatant status, the feigning of protected status by the means of signs, emblems, or uniforms of the United Nations, the Red Cross, or other neutral or other states or parties to the conflict. And under Article 38, it's prohibited to make improper use of the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross in particular. And under Article 39, it's forbidden to make use of flags, emblems, insignia, or uniforms of neutral or other states not party to the conflict. There's a biblical principle behind all this too. Leviticus 19 verse 11 says, "You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor shall you lie to one another." But there are many documented cases of false flag attacks where government has carried out, for example, for political purposes, a terror attack upon their own people and then falsely blamed its targeted enemy. Romans 3:13 warns us of this. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps or snakes is under their lips. A very classic false flag is the Great Fire of Rome. In AD 64, 19th of July, 2/3 of the city of Rome was burned down in a huge fire. This has been dramatized in films like Quo Vadis. Senior Roman leaders, including the Roman consul Cassius Dio and the historian Suetonius, confirmed that the Emperor Nero sent out his arsonists to start the fire because the Roman Senate had just rejected Nero's application to clear 300 acres in central Rome so he could build his extravagant palace complex. Nero then falsely blamed the Christians for starting the fire, which he had initiated, and he just used this to justify rounding up, brutally torturing and murdering many hundreds of Christians, including the apostles Peter and Paul. As Proverbs 12:19 says, the truthful lip shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. You might recall in 1898 the highly suspicious explosion which sank the USS Maine warship in the harbor of Havana in Cuba, and this killed over 260 American seamen, and it sparked the Spanish-American War, which provided America the context or the pretext to destroy the Spanish fleet and to seize much of their territory, including the Philippines and Cuba. And the Spanish-American War has been proven to have started with a false flag, and the USS Maine, and they used, remember the Maine as the main battle cry to motivate the war and support for the war, and it turns out that, in fact, the explosion came from within the ship. It was an own goal. It was not a torpedo. It wasn't an attack from the Spanish. The Spanish wouldn't have been that stupid as to provoke a war with the United States at that moment, and it just suited America's expansionist policies at that time. Psalm 101 verse 7 says, "He who works deceit shall not dwell within my house. He who tells lies shall not continue in my presence." Another well-documented false flag campaign was the Manchurian incident. On the 18th of September 1931, Japanese troops set off a small explosion on a train track and blamed it on China in order to justify their invasion of Manchuria. This is known as the Mukden incident or the Manchurian incident. And then there's another classic which we all know about. The 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the US fleet at Pearl Harbor, destroying the Pacific Fleet and forcing the United States into World War II. Well, that is what we were taught at school. However, except for the date, almost everything about that narrative is a myth. The attack was not such a surprise. In fact, the Honolulu newspaper the week before was saying, Japanese to attack this weekend, and that was the headline on the front page. And the Pacific Fleet was actually far from destroyed because the aircraft carriers were conveniently absent, but the battleships were badly damaged or destroyed or sunk. Actually, the United States government had done everything they could to bring about this attack. The American ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, on the 27th of January 1941, wired Washington that Japan was preparing for a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And on 24th of September 1941, a dispatch from Japanese naval intelligence to Japan's consulate general in Honolulu was deciphered because the Americans had, in fact, managed to crack their code, the purple code. The transmission was a request for the grid of exact locations of U.S. naval ships in Pearl Harbor. Yet Washington chose not to share this information with the officers who were responsible for security at Pearl Harbor. On the 26th of November 1941, the main body of the Japanese strike force, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 submarines, and 5 midget submarines. This fleet departed Japan for Hawaii. And despite the myth of strict radio silence, the U.S. naval intelligence intercepted many dispatches, and Tokyo actually sent over 1,000 radio transmissions to the attack fleet before it reached Hawaii. The dispatches left no doubt to military intelligence that Pearl Harbor was the target. Even on the night before the attack, the US Naval Intelligence decoded a message pointing to Sunday morning, the 7th of December, as the deadline for the attack. And the message was delivered to military high command in Washington, D.C., more than 4 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, before it even began. However, this information was still withheld from the naval and army commanders at Pearl Harbor. And having failed to provoke Germany by already selling over 50 billion US dollars in war supplies to Great Britain and given to the Soviet Union, paid for by South African gold, by the way, FDR switched focus to Japan. On the 7th of October 1940, one of Roosevelt's military advisors, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Cullum, detailed an 8-step plan to provoke Japan into attacking the United States. Over the next year, FDR implemented all 8 of the recommended provocative actions, including a complete oil embargo against Japan and effective economic warfare. Zechariah 8 verse 16 says, "These are the things you shall do. Speak each man the truth to his neighbor. Give judgment in your gates for justice, for truth, and for peace." It should also be noted that the attack on Pearl Harbor was hardly unprecedented, because the British Royal Navy, which was the model for the Japanese Navy, and in fact the Imperial Japanese Navy was not just modeled on the British Royal Navy, but had been trained by them because they were Britain's ally in the First World War. The British had a doctrine of Copenhagen the fleet of even neutral powers if they could potentially be used as a threat to the Royal Navy. The British Royal Navy had a doctrine for centuries of making sure that the Royal Navy was stronger than the 2 next naval powers combined. And so that had been their doctrine for a long time. And at one point, well, actually twice, they attacked the Danish fleet, which was pretty substantial, in neutral Denmark, even without a declaration of war, surprise attacks. And Admiral Lord Nelson was part of one of these attacks, which is where he classically puts the telescope to his blind eye, and that's where the term turning a blind eye to something. He is instructed to break off the attack and withdraw, and he continued to pulverize and destroy the Copenhagen fleet, the Danish fleet in Copenhagen, and that's where the turning a blind eye comes from. Well, Copenhagen the fleet, destroying the fleet of even a neutral country, just in case they might one day decide to join the enemy, which in that time was France, was justified by British naval doctrine. But then even immediately before Pearl Harbor, Britain had destroyed the fleet of the French allies, just in case it might fall into the hands of Germans, even though the peace treaty with France did not require France to hand over any naval ships. In fact, when some of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine had requested that, Adolf Hitler had said, well, the army was defeated, not the navy, and we've got no right to ask France to hand over their navy because their navy was never defeated by the Kriegsmarine in battle. And therefore there was no danger of the French navy falling into the hands of Germans because, in fact, that part of Vichy France was being self-governed by France, and it wasn't part of the occupied area that Germany had taken control of on the English Channel. That was now in the Mediterranean, and it was with the French North African territories, such as by Algeria. And not only had the Royal Navy Copenhagen the fleet of France, a neutral ally, mind you, at that stage, but they had also used torpedo planes launched from aircraft carriers, biplanes, Fairy Girl, Swordfish, operating off aircraft carriers to destroy battleships in Taranto Harbour, which was considered very safe and too shallow for torpedoes to operate. And the Royal Navy had sunk Italian naval battleships in Taranto Harbour. And all of this was well known before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So the torpedo attack by aircraft carrier launched torpedo planes at Pearl Harbor was not unprecedented. So this unprecedented surprise attack is a bit of propaganda. It was basically a provoked attack, which very much the US president wanted as an excuse to get involved in the war in Europe. Even though they were attacked in the Pacific, they left the Pacific till 1945 before they made that a priority. The priority was Europe, helping the Soviet Union, saving Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union. Vast amount of US weapons and manpower went to Europe. In fact, you could say 80% of the US military hardware and manpower went to Europe immediately after Pearl Harbor. So although they were attacked in the Pacific, that was not the priority. That was just a pretext to get isolationist America into the war to save the Soviet Union. But that's all been well documented. Now, there are other false flag attacks, and this is important to know because people think my government would never do that. Governments don't do that sort of thing. It's not, we're the good guys. Well, take the Manila incident. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev admitted the Soviet Union Red Army shelled the Russian village of Manila in 1939 in order to blame the attack on Finland as a pretext for launching their winter war against Finland, neutral Finland. The Russian President Boris Yeltsin later confirmed Russia had been the aggressor in the winter war, and the shelling of Manila was a false flag operation. The Red Army shelled their own people, civilians, in Russia and then blamed it on neighboring Finland. The Russian leaders Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin also admitted that the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin ordered the NKVD secret police to execute over 22,000 Polish officers and civilians in 1940 and to falsely blame this massacre on the Germans. Psalm 31 verse 18 declares, "Let lying lips be put to silence, which speak insolent things proudly and contemptuously against the righteous." Well, the British government later admitted to bombing 5 ships transporting Jews from Europe to Palestine between 1946 and 1948. And they set up a fake group, the Defenders of Palestine, to falsely claim responsibility for these bombings. And then in 1954, Israel admitted launching a terrorist cell to operate in Egypt to plant bombs in several buildings, including the US diplomatic facilities, leaving behind false evidence indicating or implicating the Arabs as the culprits. When one of these bombs detonated prematurely, this enabled the Egyptians to identify the bombers, and then several of these Israeli agents confessed to this false flag operation, bombing Western agencies in Egypt and blaming it on the Arabs. The CIA later admitted to hiring Iranians in the 1950s to pose as communists and to stage bombings in Iran in order to turn the country against its elected prime minister. And the Turkish prime minister later had to admit that the Turkish government carried out the 1955 bombing of a Turkish consulate in Greece and damaging the nearby birthplace of the founder of modern Turkey, blaming the bombing of Ataturk's grave place on Greece for the purpose of inciting and justifying anti-Greek violence. The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan admitted both he and the American President Dwight Eisenhower approved a CIA MI6 plan in 1957 to carry out attacks in Syria and to blame it on the Syrian government as a way of effecting regime change. A former Italian Prime Minister, an Italian judge, and former head of Italian counterintelligence admitted that NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with the help of the Pentagon and the CIA, carried out terror bombings in Italy and in other European countries in the 1950s in order to rally their people's support for the governments in Europe. We had to attack civilians, people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people, far removed from any political gain. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state and ask for greater security. And these terror attacks, Operation Gladio, these terror bombings in Europe, were carried out in Italy, France, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and other countries of Europe. blamed it on communist anarchist groups, but actually this was Operation Gladio. This was terror attacks being waged on their own population to whip up public support for the government's plans. And Nahum 3 verse 4 says, "It is all full of lies and robbery. Its victims never depart." The National Security Agency, the NSA, later admitted that it lied about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. They manipulated data to make it look like the North Vietnamese boats fired at US battleships, which was to create a justification for American involvement in the Vietnam War. It was a fairly impossible story that some torpedo boats fired on American battleships. I mean, those must have been some of the bravest naval torpedo boat commanders in history, or some of the stupidest. But it turned out it didn't happen. It was completely fabricated in order to justify America getting involved in the Vietnam War, which cost vast amounts of lives, caused huge amounts of damage, ran up massive amounts of debts, but enriched some military-industrial complex manufacturers, of course. Then there's the bombing of the USS Liberty. On the 8th of June, 1967, unmarked Israeli fighter jets, Mirages, and an unmarked torpedo boat attacked the USS Liberty, an American espionage ship off the coast of Egypt, with cannon fire, napalm, rockets, and torpedoes. The attack started by jamming the ship's emergency distress channel and then targeted the communications of the ship to prevent the Americans radioing for help. They took out the radar, they took out the radio aerial, they took out the radio station in USS Liberty first, and then as sailors attempted to escape in life rafts, they were shot and the life rafts were destroyed in order to prevent any survivors from escaping. 34 American crewmen were killed and 174 were wounded. Admiral Thomas Moore, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said a year after the incident, he concluded that the attempted sinking of the USS Liberty was a failed false flag attack. Israel was attempting to blame Egypt for the attack to persuade America to join in on the attack on Egypt. And this was a joint operation. The CIA, the US State Department, President Lyndon Johnson were actually working together with Israel for this false flag attack to justify America dispatching nuclear-armed fighter jets to drop nuclear bombs on Cairo, Egypt. In fact, they had already actually dispatched nuclear-armed fighter jets to bomb Cairo with a nuclear bomb. And these jets only recalled when it was exposed that it was actually the Israelis, not the Egyptians, who had fired on the USS Liberty. Evidence has come out that, without a shadow of a doubt, this is Lyndon Johnson's plan. It wasn't just the Israelis trying to manipulate the Americans into war. The American government, deep state, and the Israeli government were working together for justification through this false flag attack on the USS Liberty to frame it on the Egyptians to justify America getting involved in the war against Egypt. Jeremiah 7 verse 28 says, "This is a nation that does not obey the voice of the Lord or their God, nor receive correction. Truth has perished and has been cut off from their mouth." There's other false flag attacks, which, these just seem incredible. A Turkish general admitted Turkish forces burned down a mosque on the island of Cyprus in the 1970s to blame it on a Greek Christian enemy. He explained in special ways certain acts of sabotage are staged and blamed on the enemy to increase public resistance. "We did this in Cyprus. We even burned down a mosque." Psalm 5 verse 6 says, "You shall destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man." Well, in the 1980s, a Mossad agent admitted Israeli agents planted a radio transmitter in Gaddafi's compound in Libya, in Tripoli, which broadcast fake terrorist transmissions in order to frame Gaddafi, the head of Libya, as a supporter of anti-American terrorism, to convince the American President Ronald Reagan to bomb Libya. Psalm 120 verse 2 says, "Deliver my soul, Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue." An Algerian diplomat and several officers of the Algerian army admitted that in the 1990s, the Algerian army frequently massacred Algerian civilians to blame on opponents of the state. Can you imagine your own government wanting to kill its own citizens to justify actions against enemies? An Indonesian fact-finding team investigating violent riots which occurred in 1998 determined that elements of their own military had been involved in instigating the riots, some of which were deliberately provoked. And then there's a very big false flag operation, the Oklahoma City bombing. 19th of April 1995, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was destroyed by a devastating bombing which collapsed about 1/3 of the building, killing 168 people, including 15 children, injuring more than 680 other people. The bomb blast damaged 324 other buildings within a 16-block radius, shattered glass in 258 nearby buildings, and burned out 86 vehicles. And the damage estimated at $652 million. The video documentary A Noble Lie documents the web of deceit, the inconsistencies, the impossibility of the official version, and presents damning evidence of a false flag operation under President Bill Clinton and the cover-up by the FBI and ATF. It was a false flag own goal. Other proven false flags include the murder of the Turkish Prime Minister in 1960, the bombing in Portugal in 1966, the Piazza Fontana massacre in Italy 1969, the terror attacks in Turkey of 1971, the Patera bombings of Italy 1972, the shootings in Brescia, Italy, the bombing of an Italian train 1974, the shootings in Istanbul, Turkey in 1977, the Ochoa massacre in Madrid in Spain 1977, the abduction and murder of the Italian Prime Minister in 1978. These are all false flags carried out by their own government's own goals. The bombing of the Bologna railway station, Italy in 1980, the blowing up of a Russian apartment building in 1999, blaming it on the Chechens, the 2001 anthrax attacks in the United States, we all remember that, those were false flags, the Indonesian military killing of American teachers in Papua New Guinea, blaming it on a Papua New Guinea separatist group in order to get that group listed as a terrorist organization, but was carried out by the Indonesians themselves. And then the highly respected writer for The Telegraph, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, reported that the head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Bandar, admitted the Saudi government controls the Chechen terrorists. And Ukrainian officials admit that Ukrainian snipers fired on both sides to create maximum chaos, leading to the Ukrainian coup and civil war of 2014. And the chemicals weapons attacks on Syria. On the 8th of April 2014, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, Seymour Hersh, published an expose revealing the Turkish government carried out the chemical weapons attacks which were blamed on the Syrian government. Remember, although Turkey is a member of NATO, Turkey provided the sarin chemical weapons. And the US President Barack Hussein Obama attempted to use this pretext, this false flag, as a justification to launch America into a full-scale war against Syria. Fortunately, phenomenal ground-level opposition America prevented that. High-level US intelligence officers confirmed it was the US and the Turkish-backed rebels, not the Syrian government, who carried out the chemicals weapons attacks in Syria. As Proverbs 12 verse 22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. Now, there are those who claim that the US government agencies were involved in the 9/11 terror attacks in Washington, D.C. and New York, and there are hundreds of engineers, I think it's over 1,000 mark, in America who have written documents stating it's absolutely impossible, engineeringly impossible, for aluminium planes to smash through reinforced concrete pillars and to bring down those buildings. And scientists who've all said the official version doesn't make sense. And so there's obviously got to be some cover-up, and some government's involvement in this 9/11 terror attacks may have been false flags. David Steele, formerly a US Marine and a CIA agent, testified, most terrorists are false flag terrorists or are created by our own security forces. In the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism. We have become a lunatic asylum. And the British Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, declared, "The truth is there is no Islamic army or terrorist army called Al-Qaeda, and any informed intelligence officer knows this. But there is a propaganda campaign to make the public believe in the presence of an intensified entity representing the devil only in order to drive TV watchers to accept a unified international leadership for a war against terrorism. The country behind all this propaganda is the United States." And we read from Howard Zinn, "Terrorism has replaced communism as the rationale for the militarization of America, for military adventures abroad, and for the suppression of civil liberties at home. It serves the same purpose, serving to create hysteria." And then we have a speech by Dr. Michael Trzaskowski, University of Ottawa's Emeritus Professor of Economics. And this speech was delivered at the International Conference of the New World Order. "We are dealing with a criminal undertaking on a global level. There's an ongoing war. It is led by the United States government. It may be carried out by a number of proxy countries which are obeying orders from Washington. The global war on terrorism is a US undertaking which is fake. It is based on fake premises. It tells us that somehow America and the Western world are going after an enemy, the Islamic State, when in fact the Islamic State is fully supported and financed by Western military alliance and by America's allies in the Persian Gulf. These Muslims are terrorists, but it just so happens these terrorists are made in America. The global war on terrorism is a fabrication, a big lie, a crime against humanity." And the evidence is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were started by the deep state in the United States of America. In fact, the American Ambassador Stevens, who got murdered in Benghazi, was the bagman who took the first $500 million to get ISIS started. And if one follows the money, you can see that the people with the most to gain from these attacks and from these wars occupy the key military and civilian positions and they're instrumental in the covering up of these crimes. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, products of the CIA, basically. Study the history of false flag attacks used to manipulate the minds of the people. In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, and nations and epochs, insanity is the rule. So said Friedrich Nietzsche. Psalm 19 verse 9 says, "The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Hermann Goering stated, "Why, of course the people don't want war, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy. It's always a simple matter to drag people along. Whether it's in a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country." And Joseph Stalin once said, "The easiest way to gain control of a country is to carry out acts of terror. The public will clamour for such laws if their personal security is threatened." And as Joseph Stalin said, it doesn't matter who votes. What counts is those who count the votes. Jeremiah 17 verse 9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" So for people who think it's not possible that there could be false flags and think, surely terror attacks of the scope of the October the 7th, 2023 terror attacks from Gaza and Israel and 9/11 or the assassination of Charlie Kirk, these couldn't possibly be false flags. Well, look at how much lying and covering up there's been of the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy, which the evidence is high that this was an inside job. And everyone from the FBI, the CIA, the local police, all the way up to the Supreme Court in America were involved in the cover-up. And it was a major cover-up. And I think the more you look at the John F. Kennedy assassination, the more you can see this was a conspiracy. The very term conspiracy theory came about, it was coined in 1963 after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, that anyone who didn't believe the official narrative of no conspiracy, one lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible for the multiple shootings of from different directions of President Kennedy, and one lone gunman up in this building from this window managed to fire all those shots in this limited amount of time from different directions, mind you, despite the clear evidence of there being multiple shooters from different directions and the forensic evidence, all the rest. If you didn't believe the official narrative, you were labeled a conspiracy theorist. Well, now we know that there was a conspiracy and it wasn't a theory, it was a conspiracy fact. And so when people tell you that you're a conspiracy theorist, these days it's not that we're the far right, it's that we are the right so far. And it's a matter of, does anyone have any new conspiracy theories? Because all of the conspiracies we've had have been proved to be fact now. And we recommend reading Freedom Betrayed by President Herbert Hoover. Katyn, exposures of the Katyn Forest Massacre, and there's a dramatic Polish film with English subtitles just called Katyn, Katyn. A Noble Lie on the Oklahoma City 1995 bombing. That video documentary is phenomenal. And then there's the Agenda and Agenda 2 video documentaries. These will prove beyond a doubt to you that there are lots of false flags out there, and we should not rule out the possibility that governments sometimes, if not often, target their own citizens to justify the increasingly intrusive legislation taking away people's liberties and the excessive, expensive wars that they get their countries involved in. There's global criminal enterprises that we are dealing with, the deep state, the Sabbateans. There's a lot that we can learn about this, and we should seriously consider it. You can go back into Frontline Fellowship records and see we've got false flags and subversion campaigns, presentation and article written back in 2018 in the Christian Action magazine as a front cover article. Lots of documentation. A Noble Lie on the Oklahoma City bombing is an absolutely must watch, and you will understand that governments can do heinous things to their own citizens, even while claiming to be so self-righteous and condemning those who are behind the attacks that they personally planned. God bless and good night. We should conclude with the scripture, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? From Jeremiah 17 verse 9. Please join us next week, same time, for From the Front Line.